any code which runs on the server.
Тренды равно возможности. И понятно, что есть очевидные тренды, такие как маски, антисептики.
On the server between getting a request and sending a response. So the request comes in, and any kind of code or function that runs between getting that request and sending a response is technically middleware. Now, the use method is generally used to run some middleware code, and we've seen that already when we handled our 404 cases. Now, we don't just have to have one bit of middleware, we could have more than one piece of middleware that runs on the server. So in this case right here, 3 functions would run on the server before maybe a response is sent. Now, the functions that run in our get handlers are also essentially middleware. Remember, middleware is just functions or code which runs on the server between the request coming in and the response going back to the browser. The difference being that get handlers right here only fire functions for get requests to a certain route. The use method right here, they run for every type of request to all routes, including post requests. Now, middleware runs from top to bottom in our code, and it runs that way until we exit the process or explicitly send a response to the browser. So for example, say we have all this middleware on our server. Now we send a request to just / and that request comes to the server. The first lot of middleware in the use function, that fires, and it gets to this second one, which is a get handler, still middleware, and it matches this route, and this function fires as well. Now inside this function, we send a response to the browser. Now, beyond this GET request, therefore, no other middleware is executed because the response is being sent. Therefore, we don't carry on down the code. So the order of middleware is very important to how it runs. And we've actually already been using middleware a lot without really noticing when we've been adding route handler functions or setting up 404 handlers with the use method. Now, aside from route handlers like this, there's a ton of other stuff we can do with middleware. So, for example, we could create a logger middleware function to log the details of every request coming into the server. We could create middleware for authentication checks. We can use middleware to pass JSON data sent from post requests, or use middleware to return a 404 page, as we've already seen. There's many other things we can do with middleware as well. But now let's try creating our own middleware in the code. So then, we've already seen a bit of custom middleware we've created down here using the use method. So this is to handle 404 cases. So for every request, this will fire as long as a response has not yet been set. Remember, it runs top to bottom. So if this matches, or this matches, or this matches, then it's going to send a response in each of those cases. Now, if none of those match, it's going to find its way to the bottom, and this middleware will fire and then send a response to the browser, a 404 page, okay? So that's an example of using middleware. And this has to be at the bottom, remember, because if we place this at the top up here, then when a request comes in, because it runs top to bottom and this fires for every single request, it's not scoped to a specific URL, then it's going to send a response straight away at the top for every request, and we're going to get a 404 for every request. And the code is never going to reach any of these handlers, right? So that's why it has to be at the bottom. It's kind of like a catch-all. So now let's create our own custom middleware that's going to sit at the top, and this middleware is going to log some details out to the console for every request. So let's try that. So again, we're going to say app.use to create some middleware. This takes in a function, and inside this function we can take in the request object and also the response object. Now what I'm going to do in here is just log a few things to the console, and I'm going to paste that so you don't have to get bored watching me type that out. All I'm doing is saying a new request was made, then I'm outputting the host, which is a property on the request object, the host name, that should be localhost, then the path, and then the method. So let's take a look at this in action. Remember, this is going to fire for every single request because it's at the top. So I'm going to open up my terminal, make sure we're running the server, which we are, and then I'm going to just refresh over here. Now, if I take a look over here, we can see a new request was made. The host is localhost, the path is / and the method is get. So path right here is a bit like the URL property we used before. But if we go back to the browser, we can see that this is actually still hanging. Nothing's happened. And if I go to something else like / about, we can come over here and we can see these details logged, and the browser still hangs. It's not gone to the about page. Why is that? Well, that's because after Express runs this code right here, it doesn't know what to do next. It doesn't know how to move on to the next middleware down here. So let's address that issue next. So we've seen how the browser hangs when we run this middleware right here because Express doesn't automatically know how to move on. We have to explicitly tell it to move on to the next function down here. And we do that by using a function called next. Now we get access to that function up here in the parameters. So we can say next right here. So this is a function, and all we have to do is invoke it right here, and that says to Express, look, we're finished inside this middleware, now move on to the next lot, because we're not sending a response to the browser, we're just wanting to do something, now you can move on. And so it fires this function to do that, and comes down here and finds whatever URL we've gone to, for example /about, and it will fire that handler as well. Okay, so if I save this now and preview, and we'll go to the homepage, now it works, and we still get the information logged to the console. Cool. So let's just test this out a little bit more by creating now another bit of middleware. So all I'm going to do is copy this, and I'm going to paste it right down below, and I'm going to get rid of these things right here, and all I'm going to do inside here is just say in the next middleware. So a really pointless piece of middleware, but nonetheless, I just want to demonstrate what's happening. So a request should hopefully come in now to the server. It fires this middleware, does all this login, goes to the next bit of middleware, comes down here and says, okay, well now I'm going to fire this middleware. It logs this to the console, and then it carries on because we say next. Then it comes down here and tries to match one of these things. All right, so let's save that and preview. So if we go to, for example, /about by clicking this link over here, we get the page, everything works, and in the console we can see a request was made, all of this was logged, and now we're in the next middleware. So it fired that one as well right here. Now, just a quick test, if we were to say place this after the homepage, right here, this is the homepage handler, and save it. If I now go to the homepage, then we get this page, but over here, we don't get this log to the console for that request. We get it right here, but this is a request from the CSS, so don't confuse that with us going to a different page. If we scroll up, we can see right here, the path was just / the method get, and we don't get in the next middleware right there because we send a response right here, so it never reaches this, okay?
Как обычно. Что случилось?
Да вот, открыл.
So one of the great things about using Node and Express is that there's tons of middleware functions already created for us that we can use. For example, there's middleware called Morgan, which is a logger, and it does a similar thing to our custom middleware where we log stuff to the console, but it's better than this. There's also one called Helmet, which is a security piece of middleware. There's middleware for using sessions, cookies, validation, loads of different things. So all of these middleware functions are ready-made for us, so we don't have to write all of our middleware from scratch every time. If there's a middleware package that solves the issue, we can just use that. So what I'm going to do is show you how to use a third-party middleware called Morgan, which is a logger, and we can just install this using npm, then require it like this. Then down here we can use Morgan by saying Morgan and invoking the function, and then passing in an option which basically dictates how the log is going to be formatted. So let's go and do this. First of all, open up your terminal and cancel out of the process, then install Morgan by saying npm install Morgan. Remember, if you've got an old version of npm, then you need the # save flag. Otherwise, just press enter and that's going to install it for us. And we should see that now inside our package file right here. Cool. So now let's require this at the top. So const Morgan is equal to require, and then it's going to be Morgan. And then down here, what I'm going to do is get rid of this middleware. I'm also going to get rid of the middleware we created down here. We don't need that. And then up here, I'm going to say we want to use, so app.use some middleware. Now, we don't use our own function like this and do something inside it. Instead, we can just invoke the function we required right here, this bit of middleware, so Morgan. And then we want to pass through an option. I'm going to use the dev option. And again, that just dictates how it's going to be formatted, what we log to the console. So if I save this now and run nodemon app, then hopefully this is all going to work. I'm going to go to the website and refresh, and we can see this logged to the console right here. Now, if I go to the About page, we're going to see this logged again. So that is what this bit of middleware is doing. And we can change this in here with different options. You can read all about it on the Morgan documentation. So if I refresh, we can see it's slightly different, the way it's output. This is this one, this is this one. Not much difference, but slightly different. So let's change that back to dev and try a new one, new blog. And we can see this right here. Cool. So that's third-party middleware in a nutshell. Again, there's absolutely loads of middleware we can use, and we can also use middleware which comes shipped with Express, and we'll do that to serve static files like CSS files for our HTML pages. Okay then, my friends, so currently if we added some kind of static files to our project over here, for example images or a CSS file, then we wouldn't be able to automatically access that file from the browser. So let me just demo this. Let me create a new file and just call this like styles.css, And then inside here, let's just do like a body selector and say the background is going to be black, right? Now, if I try to access this styles.css file from the front end, I'm not going to be able to. I can't do something like this, you know, /styles.css. It's not going to give me that. In fact, I'm just going to get the 404 page. So if we can't access them from the browser like this, then even if we place a link to them currently inside our templates, our HTML, so for example, if we go to the head, we couldn't add a link inside the head like this, like this, which is going to link to stylesheet, or not stylesheet, styles.css. This wouldn't work. It wouldn't just reference that in the browser, and I can demo that as well. If we go to the home page and inspect, and if we go to the network and then refresh, we can see that this styles.css returns a 404 error because it's not allowing us access to that file. So the server protects all of our files automatically from users in a browser, so they can't just access any of our files whenever they want to. To allow the browser access to something, we have to specify what files should be allowed to be accessed. In other words, what files should be public. Now, to do that, we can use some ready-made middleware that comes along with Express, and that is the static middleware. So let me cross this off and go over here and go to the app, and I'm going to create a little comment right here that says middleware and static files. And by static files, I mean things like CSS, images that we're going to make public, right? So the first bit of middleware we have is this Morgan, but now we also want to create one above that. So app.use, and we want to use express.static. So here we're setting up our static files, and all we have to do is pass in here a folder name, for example, public. And that means that if I create a folder over here called public, then anything inside that folder is going to be made available as a static file to the front end. So if I place styles.css inside there now and go back to the browser and refresh, then you can see that those styles are loading because we're linking to that from the nav, and now it's accessible, right? Not the nav, sorry, from the head right here. So it's important we don't say /public/styles, we just do /styles, and it just looks automatically in the public folder because we specified in app.js that that is the folder we want to make public to the browser, okay? So likewise, if I try to just access this directly, styles.css, then we can see that style sheet. It works, right? It's public to the browser. So all I really want to do now is go back to the head and take all of this stuff inside the style tag and cut that from there, and instead paste it inside this thing. So now we have all of our styles inside an external file, which is better than having them directly in this head. So if I save it now, hopefully, if we refresh, then we still see all the same files, even though now they're not directly embedded inside the head. They're in a separate CSS file that we're linking to from the head. And the same is true for any other kind of file. If we place images in here or other text files or whatever we place in here, all of that is going to be accessible at the root level on our website from the browser. And it's all achieved by using the static middleware that comes along for the ride when we use Express.
Меняйте свой старый пылесос на новый, инновационный и мощный пылесос без проводов Samsung Jet со скидкой до 50 тысяч тенге.
Alright then gang, so now we've figured out how to use templates and middleware. I want to go one step further and introduce a database to the mix as well, so we can store data in that. And then we can get that data and inject it into our views when we need to. So when we're working with databases, there's a couple of main types we typically choose from. The first type is a SQL database like MySQL, and the second type is a NoSQL database, and both of those structure data differently. So SQL databases use tables, rows, and columns to store records of data, and NoSQL databases instead make use of collections and documents. Now, the one that we'll be using is called MongoDB, and that is a NoSQL database. So how exactly does a NoSQL database work? Well, it's split up into collections, and they are a bit like tables in SQL databases. So each collection would be used to store a particular type of data. For example, a user collection would store user documents. Now, in our case, for our project, we might have a blog collection to store blog documents, and you can have as many different collections as you want, but the important thing to remember is that each one would contain only one type of document, be it user, blog, author, or something else. So each collection would store documents, and in our case, that is going to be blog documents. Now, a document is a bit like a record in a SQL database. Each one represents a single item of data. So a blog document represents a single blog. Now, these documents are stored in a format that looks very similar to JSON or JavaScript objects. They basically hold a series of key and value pairs. For example, a blog document could have a title, a snippet, and a body property, and it would also have this auto-generated unique ID to identify it as well. So from our code, we could connect to a collection like the blogs in MongoDB, and then we could either save, read, update, or delete documents inside it. So let's start by creating a database and hooking it up with our code. So then, when we're working with MongoDB, there's a couple of different setup options that we can use. We can either install MongoDB on our computer locally and use and then deploy that, or we could use a cloud database which is already hosted for us, and it can be quite a lot easier for us to manage. So we're going to do that. Now, the cloud service we're going to be using to make this database is called MongoDB Atlas, and you can find that at this web address, which I will leave down below. Now, it's completely free to begin with, and you can sign up for a free account right here by clicking on this button and just signing up. I already have an account, so I'm going to just log in right here with my Google account. And then when you sign up, you should see this page. Now, it might look a little bit different when you view this, depending on when you're watching the video. They do change their design a little bit, but the functionality underneath is the same. So the first thing we need to do is to build a new cluster. So click on that button, and we want to create a free one, unless you've got money to splash and you want to sign up for one of the premium options. Then we want to choose a provider and region. I'm going to stick with the defaults right there. We can give our cluster a name if you want. I'm just going to call this Node Tuts, like so. You can leave it as the default if you prefer. It really doesn't matter at the minute, especially for this tutorial. And then it's going to just take a couple of minutes to create that cluster. So then once that's done, the next step is to create a database and a collection inside that database. So let's click on collections to do that. And then we want to add our own data. We need to give this database a name, call it what you will. I'm going to call it Node Tuts. And then we need a collection name. Remember, a collection is where we're going to store a load of documents of a certain type. So we're going to store blog documents for our blog in there. So we'll call this blogs. Make sense? And I'm going to create this collection. So this is our collection right here. There's no documents in it at the minute. What I'm going to do now is create a user so that we can use that user for database access from our code over here. So let's go to database access and create a new database user. I'm going to call this NetNinja, and the password is going to be test1234. Please create something that's more unique than that and more secure. We need to give read and write access to any database, and I'm going to add user right here. So I'm going to use that user later on, the username and the password I created from our code, so that we can connect to the database. That way, not anyone can just connect to the database, only a valid user that we declare right here. So some kind of admin user. All right, so now we need to go back to clusters, and we need to figure out a way to connect to this database. So I'm going to connect right here, and then we want to connect from our application, like so. And this connection string we're going to need later on. So I'm going to copy this right here, and I'm going to go back over to our app file, and I'm going to create, for now, just a new variable, so const, and I'll call this dburi and set it equal to the string, like so. So we're going to use that shortly to connect to our database. And in fact, I'm going to grab that, and I'm going to paste it actually below where we declare our app. And I'm going to also do a little comment that says connect to MongoDB. So this is the connection string that we're going to use later on to connect to our database. And we're going to replace this right here with our username, which is NetNinja, which we just created, right? And this is test1234. That was our password. So then now we need to actually connect to the database. And we could connect using the plain MongoDB API and package, and we could use the regular MongoDB API to make queries to the database too, but that can sometimes be a bit clunky and verbose. So instead, we'll be using something called Mongoose to connect and interact with the database, which I think makes it a bit easier and it's nicer to work with. So let's take a quick look at what Mongoose actually is. Okay then, my friends, so Mongoose is an ODM library, and that is an object document mapping library. And that basically means that it wraps the standard MongoDB API, and it provides us with a much easier way to connect to and communicate with the database. Now, it does this by allowing us to create simple data models which have database query methods to create, get, delete, and update database documents. Now, under the hood, Mongoose does all the heavy lifting for us. It queries the correct database collection for us based on the name of the model we use, and then it performs the action required and returns us a response. Now, you don't have to use Mongoose. You can just use the standalone MongoDB library if you prefer, but sometimes it can feel a bit more clunky and verbose. So we're going to use Mongoose, and let me break down exactly how we're going to be using it in our project. So the way we generally work with MongoDB and Mongoose is to create schemas and models. Now, this is quite similar to how we typically work with any kind of data resource. We'd make a model to represent that data resource. Now, in Mongoose, though, we make a schema first. Now, the schema defines the structure of a data type or document stored in a database collection. It describes what properties it should have, the type of those properties, etc. So, for example, a user data type might have a username, a bio, and an age. Now, in our case, we're working with blogs. So we'd have a schema for a blog. Now, that's going to have three properties. It's going to have a title, a snippet, and a body, and it's also going to have an auto-generated ID property as well. Now, these properties are all going to be of type string, and all of the fields will be also required. So our schema will define the structure of our blog documents like this, and that will be the structure of documents stored in our blog collection in the database. Now, the next thing we do is to create a model based on that schema. Now, the model is the thing that actually allows us to communicate with a particular database collection. For example, if we create a blog model, which is based on a blog schema, the blog model will then have both static and instance methods, which we can use to save, update, delete, or read data from the blog's collection. So that's kind of the theory behind it. Don't worry so much if you don't fully understand it yet. We're going to have plenty of practice, and let's start by using Mongoose to connect to the database. Okay then, so the next step is to actually connect to the database using Mongoose. So to do that, we have to install Mongoose because it is a third-party package, and we'll say npm install Mongoose to do that. So we can then require it up here by saying const mongoose is equal to a require, and the package name is Mongoose. So now we can use this Mongoose object right here to connect to the database. And I'll do that down here by saying Mongoose, and then use a method called connect like so. Now this expects as an argument a connection string like this. Now before we pass it in, I do want to make a quick change to this. At the minute it's going to connect to a test database. That's what this means right here. But we want to connect to this database node tuts that we created. So I'm going to replace test with whatever this says right here, so node tuts, so that it connects to that database like so. Okay, so now I'm going to pass this thing right here, this constant, into this connect method, and then Mongoose is going to go out and connect to that database for us. Now, if I was to save this right now and run it, we might get a deprecation warning. So let me say nodemon app to run this, and you can see right here we get a deprecation warning. Now, you can leave that if you want to. It's not really going to affect how we use the code, but what I'm going to do is pass in a second argument, which is an options object to this connect method. So I'm just going to paste this in. You can pause it and write it as well, and this is just going to stop those deprecation warnings. But like I say, it's not going to affect how we write the code in the future. So now if I save this and run the file again, we shouldn't get those deprecation warnings down here. Awesome. Now this right here is actually an asynchronous task. It goes out and it takes some time to do, and therefore it returns something like a promise, and we can tack on the then method to it. So this then method takes in a callback function which is going to fire when this connection is complete, after it's connected to the database, and we get a result in this callback function which we can use if we want to. I'm just going to say in here console.log connected to DB. And we also get a catch method. In case there's an error, we can catch the error, and we'll do that inside a callback function, and we'll log that to the console as well. Now, hopefully there won't be any errors, but let's just test this out. We should hopefully see this logged to the console right here. So let me save this and run it, and you can see it takes a little bit of time, but after a couple of seconds, we should see this thing right here connected to the database. Awesome, so that works. Now then, if you think about it, we don't really want our server to be listening for requests until this connection has been made, because, for example, if a user requests the homepage and that homepage lists a load of data dependent on the database, then we can't show that until the connection to the database has been established. So we really don't want to be listening for requests until this is completed. So what we could do is we could take this and we could paste it inside this then block instead, and then we're only going to listen for requests after this connection is complete. And that makes sense. So let's delete this down here, save it, and make sure there's no errors, which there's not. Awesome. Okay, so the next thing to do now is to create a schema and a model for our blog data. So I'm going to create a new folder for all of my models and schemas over here, and I'm going to call that folder models. Now we want to create a model and a schema for a blog. So let's create a new file called blog.js. Alright, so inside here, the first thing we need to do is require Mongoose. So const mongoose is equal to require, and it's going to be the Mongoose package. Then we also need to get something from the Mongoose object right here, and that is the schema. So I'm going to say const schema with a capital S is equal to mongoose app.schema with a capital S. Okay, so remember, a schema is the thing that is going to define the structure of the documents that we're going to later store inside a collection. It's the thing that a model wraps around, okay? So this thing right here is actually a constructor function, and we're going to use it to create a new schema, and we're going to store that in a constant. Now, you can call your schema whatever you want. I'm going to call it blog schema. That makes absolute sense to me, and that is equal to a new schema. So this creates a new instance of a schema object. Now, we need to pass in an object as a parameter so that this object can describe the structure of the documents that we want to store in our blogs collection ultimately. So right here, we can add the different properties that we want our blog objects to have. For example, I want to have a title, right? I want that to be a property of our blog documents. Now, right here, I can also say that this has to be of string type. Now, I also want to say this is required. So instead of just doing that, I'm going to open this up into an object, and therefore we can add some extra validation as well. So we can say the type is going to be a string, but also we're going to say that required is true. And that means that this field is required for blog documents, all right? So then let's do some more fields. We also want our blogs to have a snippet property. And again, let's open up an object so we can add the type, which is also going to be of type string, and it's also going to be required, right? So this is Mongoose creating a schema for us, and we're allowed to say what type of data each property should be and whether it's required or not. So let's just add one more, which is the body, and this also is going to be of type string, and we also want to make this required, like so. All right then, so they're the only three properties we really want on our blog schema. Now, after this object right here, we can pass in a second argument to this schema constructor, and this is a bit like an options object. Now, what I want to do is set timestamps in here to true, and this automatically generates timestamp properties for us on our blog documents as well. So like a created at and updated at property, and every time we therefore in the future update or create a blog document, it's going to auto assign values to those properties for us, and we'll see that later on when we see the data inside our collection. Okay, so first thing you need to do is spell timestamps correctly. So timestamps like so. Now, the next thing we need to do is create a model, and that model is going to be based on this blog schema. So remember, the schema is the thing that defines the structure of our documents. The model is the thing that surrounds that and then provides us with an interface by which to communicate with a database collection for that document type. So I'm going to create a new constant down here to store this model in, and typically the names of these models are given a capital letter. So I'm going to call it blog with a capital B, and I'm going to set that equal to Mongoose and then use a method called model. Now, this model takes in as a first argument the name of this model. Now, the name of this is important. I'm going to call it blog. The reason it's important is because it's going to look at this name, it's going to pluralize it, and then look for that collection inside the database whenever we use this model in the future to communicate with the database. So it's going to therefore look for blogs, right? Because we've called the model blog. So when it connects, it's going to look for this blogs collection right here automatically, so we don't need to ever say in the future, look, I want you to search the blogs collection. Whenever we use this blog thing right here in the future to find something, because we're going to get access to different methods on this in the future provided by the model, then we don't need to say find the blogs collection. It's going to automatically look for the blogs collection based on this name. All right, so that's the first argument we passed in. The second argument is going to be the schema we want to base this model on. So what type of objects are we going to store inside this collection? Well, it's going to be the blog schema we just created. All right, so that's it. 2 steps. We make our schema, which defines the structure, and then we create a model based on that schema, and we define the name of this model, which should be the singular of the collection name, and we store that inside a constant right here. Finally, the only thing we have to do now is export this model so we can use it elsewhere in the project. So remember, to do that, we can say module.export and set that equal to the blog. Phew! There we go then, my friends. We have created our blog schema and our blog model. And now we have this model, we can use it to save some new blog documents to our database collection. Okay then, so now we have our blog model right here. Let's try using this in the code to interact with the database. So then, inside app.js, what I'm going to do is create just a handful of sandbox routes, if you like, just to test out this interaction with the database. So what I'm going to do first of all is a get handler, app.get, which is going to respond to requests to /add-blog. and this is going to be used to add a blog to the collection. So we'll fire a callback when that request comes in, taking the request object and the response object. And inside, what we want to do now is create a new instance of a blog document and then save that to the blogs collection in the database. So first of all, we need to import the model that we exported right here. So let's do that right at the top. So I'm going to say const blog is equal to require, and we want to go into the models folder, so /models, and then we want the blog file. Okay, cool. So we have that now. We can create a new instance of a blog by saying down here, const blog, and you can call the constant whatever you want. This is just what I'm calling it, and then set that equal to a new blog. So we're using the model to create a new instance of a blog document within the code, and in here we pass an object with the different properties of this blog. Now remember, inside our schema we said that each blog should have a title, which is a string, a snippet, which is a string, and also a body, which is a string. We don't have to pass this in. Mongoose automatically takes care of the timestamps for us. So just these three things right here that we need to worry about. So let's add in a title property, and that is going to be new blog. Very original, right? And the snippet is going to be about my new blog. All right, and then the body is going to be more about my new blog. I really pity the people that go and read my blog, because this is about as interesting as it's going to get. Anyway, we have that new instance of the blog now, and we can use a method on this to save it to the database. And it's dead simple to do that. We just say blog, which is the new instance we just created using the blog model, and then we use a method on it called save. So when we get a new instance of the blog model, it gives us a load of different methods that we can use, and we're using one called save to save this to the database. Now, under the hood, Mongoose is going to say, well, okay, we've used the blog model, therefore I'm going to look for the blogs collection based on this name, and I'm going to take this document that you've created with this information, and I'm going to save it to the blogs collection, and it goes out and it does that for us. Now, this is an asynchronous task. It takes some time to do. It goes off and does it. It might take a second to do, probably less, but nonetheless, it takes some time, and it returns us a promise. So we can tack on a then method, which is going to fire a callback function when this promise resolves, okay? So inside this callback function, we get the result, and what we're going to do is just send back a response, so response.send, and we're going to send back the result, so we can see that in the browser. And we also want to attach a catch method to this, just in case there was any kind of error with this action, and we're going to log that to the console if there is one. Console.log error. Okay, so dead simple, right? Now let's try going to this URL in the browser. So let me say localhost 3000 /add-blog, and we get this response in the browser. And this looks like a JavaScript object, right? We have the curly braces and curly braces there, and we get an ID. This is auto-generated for us. We get a title, which is the title we give it, the snippet, about my new blog, body, etc. We also get these timestamps that Mongoose created for us right here as well. So this thing right here, this object kind of thing that we're seeing, is actually the new document object that is being sent back to us in the code once this action is complete. So once Mongoose saves it to the database then sends us back an object version of that new document. So not this object right here. This is slightly different because it doesn't have those timestamps or the ID on it or anything like that. It sends us back the actual documents inside the collection that it's saved, right? And if we actually go to the collection now over here, what I'm going to do is just refresh by clicking this button, and we should see that that document is inside this collection. Now, we don't, because I've just noticed I made a spelling error over here, but it's actually connected to the Node Tuts database, which is what I specified in my string right here. So that database didn't exist. It's going to create that for me because I was a bit of a plonker before and created one called Note Tuts. But anyway, it's created this database for me, but it also demonstrates a point. If this collection didn't already exist, then it creates it for us, which is nice. So in there, we can now see that we have total documents 1 right here, and this is that new document, right? You can see all of the different properties match up, and that is what is being sent back to us here in the browser because we send it right here, okay? Sweet. So that is how we add a new blog. If I wanted to add another one, let me say new blog 2, save it. If I go to this URL again, add blog, then it's going to add another one, and we should see new blog 2 over here. Now, that's the new document it's sending back, and if we go to the database and refresh over here, we should see 2 documents inside here now. We can see new blog and new blog 2. Awesome. So that's how simple it is to save documents to the database. All right, so let's do another one to actually get all the blogs. So say we want to retrieve all the blogs from the collection. Well, I'm going to do another get handler, and this is for /all blogs, and we'll fire a callback function which takes the request object and also the response object, and inside that function we need to then use the blog model to get all of the documents from this collection. Now this time we don't need to create a new instance of a blog because we're not creating a new document. We can just use a method directly on this blog model. So down here I'm going to say blog with a capital B, and then I'm going to use the method find, and that gets us all of the documents inside the blogs collection. It goes out and gets all of them. Now again, it's asynchronous, it takes a little while to do, so we can tack on a then method to it which fires a callback function with the results from the database when it's finished. Now all I'm going to do is send that response to the browser, so I'll send the result, which should be a list of documents right this time, and we also want to catch any errors, so let's do that as well, and console.log the error. Okay, so then let's try this. I'm going to go to /all blogs over here, so all-blogs, and we should get 2 of them. Yes we do, inside what looks like an array. So we get 2 objects. Very simple, right? So that's all there is to it. We use the model and we use a method on that model called find. So when we save it, we use an instance method right here on the instance of the blog that we create. When we're finding them, we use a method directly on the blog, not on an instance of the blog. So there is a difference right there. Okay, so let's do one more. Let's try and find a single blog. So let's do another handler, app.get, and this is going to be for a single blog, so /single-blog, and we want to fire a callback function when a request comes in for this. And inside here, again, we use the blog model, and this time I'm going to say find by ID. Okay, so you know when we saved a new document to the database, look at this ID right here. This is an object ID right here. Now this is a unique type and it's not a string when it's stored in MongoDB, but when we're using Mongoose, it handles the conversion of this into a string and back again when we need to. So if we want to find something by an ID, we can just pass in a string here, and then Mongoose is going to handle that conversion into an object ID to compare it to one of these documents and retrieve that single document. So if I go to all blogs, I could just get this one right here, for example, which is the first one, new blog, and if I paste that right in here, like so, it's going to go out and it's going to find the blog with that ID. So again, it's asynchronous. We can tack on a then method, which will fire a callback function when this is done. And inside that function, I want to take the result back from the database, and that should be a single document this time. And I want to send it as a response to the browser. So response.send the result. Again, I'm just going to copy and paste this catch block right here. We're going to catch any error if there is one and log it to the console. So let's try this. I'm going to get a single blog. So let's just delete all that. Single-blog. And we get that one blog. Now if I change this, so we use the other ID, so if I get this one right here, which is blog2, see if this works. Okay, save it and go to single blog and refresh. We should get new blog2 this time, which we do. Awesome. So there we go, my friends. That's the basics of how to interact with this database. So we've seen how to save a new blog, how to find all the blogs, and also how to find a single blog based on the ID. We're also going to see how to delete blogs later on, and we're going to put this kind of logic in proper routes later on, because this at the minute is not the way I want to go. I don't want these kind of routes. I want to integrate these into my routes that we have down here and maybe create some more in the future. So then, my friends, now we know how to interact with the MongoDB database using Mongoose. Now we can delete these kind of sandbox routes that we created and instead apply this kind of logic in some of our routes down here. And we're also going to make a couple more as we go forward as well. So these are the routes we have at the minute. We have a home page right here. We also have an about page. We have this page as well, /blogs/create, and that gives us the web form to create a new blog. So what I'm going to do is split this up into 2. So these are our basic routes, and I also want to put a comment right here. These are the blog routes, and I want to create a new one, so app.get, and it's going to be /blogs, and this is ultimately going to be the route to go to if you want to get a page back where we're going to display all of the blogs. Now, as a matter of fact, inside the home page, that's what we're currently doing with this dummy data right here. But what I'm going to do is do that down here in this handler instead. And for the sake of this tutorial, instead of rendering a view inside this handler, I'm just going to redirect it to this one right here, so that if they go to the home page, we're forwarded on to the /blogs page, and then we render out all of the blogs. Now, if you wanted to, instead, you could do a separate home page here. But like I said, for the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to forward it onto this URL. So to do that, remember, we just need to do a redirect, and we do that by saying response.redirect, and where we want to redirect to, and we want to go to /blogs. So now we go to the home page, we're redirected to /blogs, and that is going to be handled down here in the blog routes, just so we can separate these things from the normal routes a little bit. Okay, so we need a callback function. We're taking the request object and the response object. And inside here, the first thing we want to do is get all the blogs. Now, we saw how we could do that. We could use the blog model and then use the find method. And this goes out and it finds all of the documents inside the blogs collection. So tack on the .then method, because this is asynchronous, and we fire a callback function when this is done. Now, inside this callback function, we take in the result that comes back from the database. We also need a catch method to take any error, and we'll take that error into the callback function, and we'll log that to the console. Okay, so now when we have the result, remember, when we get all of the blogs, that was an array of blogs. We want to pass this into our index view over here. If we open this up and go to index, remember this expects a property called blogs. So what we could do is pass that array of blogs that we get back into that view, and we don't need to change any of this code because we're already expecting an array of blogs right here. We're cycling through them and we don't need to change any of the code. So let's do that. Let's go down here and render a view. So response.render, and we want to render the index view, and we want to pass in some data. Now the first piece of data should be the title, because we expect that title inside the head over here where we output the title. Okay, so that's the first bit of data we want to pass in. So the title in this case is just going to be all blogs. Okay, now the second bit of data we want to pass in is whatever we get back here. That's the array of blogs. So the property name is going to be blogs, and we pass in the result. That's all there is to it. So then, now we're passing in these two things. Let's save it and go back to the browser. So let me come over here and let me go to just / to see that redirect in action. We go to /blogs, and we're getting all of the documents, and now we're outputting those in the view because we're cycling through those. We did all of this before with dummy data. We're cycling through those blogs and outputting the title and the snippet for each individual blog, right? So that was pretty nice, pretty easy to do. Now, I also want to show you one more quick thing right here, and that is the sort method right here. So we can sort by a particular field inside our documents. Now, I'm going to sort by created at. Remember, these were the timestamps that Mongoose automatically added on for us. And I'm going to say -1 right here. And that means descending order. So it's going to go from the newest to the oldest. And the newest now will be at the top of the page instead of the oldest. So this should now be at the top of the page. So let me save that, and we can come over here and refresh. And we should see now that blog 2 should be at the top of the page once this refreshes. Yes, we do. So we are going to be using Mongoose with MongoDB for the rest of this series. So we'll also see how to do many more things with it. But for now, we'll leave it there. Alright then gang, so far in our website we've made only one type of request, and that is a GET request, and we've had handlers for those GET requests when we've said things like app.get. Now these types of requests are typically to get a resource from the server, whether that be JSON data from the database or a web page, doesn't really matter, they are all GET requests. But there's other types of requests too. So we have GET request to request data from the server. We also have POST requests to create new data in our database. So typically when we have a web form and hit submit, then we send a POST request to the server with that new data and it can be added to the database. We also have delete requests to delete data, for example, deleting a single blog document from the database. And we also have put requests to update existing data. Now, so far, we've seen how we can send GET requests from a browser and handle those on a server. For example, we have this route /blogs. That is a GET request, and that gets us a web page with a list of all of the blogs inside it. We also have a GET request for /blogs /create, and that gets us a web page with the web form on it. But we also need routes to interact with our data in other ways. For example, we need one to add a new blog document after we've filled in the form and then hit submit. So that needs to send a request to add a new blog, and that would be a POST request. Now, the route would be /blogs. The same as this one up here. So how can that be? Well, that's absolutely fine because this is a GET request and this is a POST request. So we can use the same routes for different types of requests because GET requests and POST requests can be handled differently from each other on the server. So that's fine. So when we click on submit on our web form, we're going to send a POST request to this URL and we're going to handle that on the server to add a new document to the database. Now, we'd also need a route item to get a single blog item. And that would look like this, /blogs /ID, where this ID variable right here changes dependent on the blog that we want to get. So it would go out and get the blog from the database with this ID, and that would be a GET request. Now, another route for deleting a blog would look something like this, /blogs/ID. And again, this would be the ID of the blog we want to delete. And again, these are the same, but it doesn't matter because we can handle a GET request separately from a delete request on the server. Finally, you might also have routes for updating blogs, and that would look something like this as well, where we have the ID that changes, but that would be a PUT request. So this route structure is the typical structure of a simple CRUD application. For every different data type or resource we have, for example, blogs, users, books, authors, whatever the resource type might be, it might look quite similar to this kind of structure of URLs and types of requests. So in our application, we're not going to use the PUT request. We're not going to update blogs, but we are going to do the to create new data in our database. So typically when we have a web form and hit submit, then we send a post request to the server with that new data and it can be added to the database. We also have delete requests to delete data, for example, deleting a single blog document from the database. And we also have PUT requests to update existing data. Now, so far, we've seen how we can send GET requests from a browser and handle those on a server. For example, we have this route /blogs. That is a GET request, and that gets us a web page with a list of all of the blogs inside it. We also have a GET request for /blogs/create, and that gets us a web page with the web form on it. But we also need routes to interact with our data in other ways. For example, we need one to add a new blog document after we've filled in the form and then hit submit. So that needs to send a request to add a new blog, and that would be a post request. Now, the route would be /blogs, the same as this one up here. So how can that be? Well, that's absolutely fine because this is a GET request and this is a post request. So we can use the same routes for different types of requests because GET requests and post requests can be handled differently from each other on the server. So that's fine. So when we click on submit on our web form, we're going to send a post request to this URL and we're going to handle that on the server to add a new document to the database. Now, we'd also need a route item to get a single blog item. And that would look like this, /blogs/ID, where this ID variable right here changes dependent on the blog that we want to get. So it would go out and get the blog from the database with this ID, and that would be a GET request. Now, another route for deleting a blog would look something like this, /blogs/ID. And again, this would be the ID of the blog we want to delete. And again, these are the same, but it doesn't matter because we can handle a GET request separately from a delete request on the server. Finally, you might also have routes for updating blogs, and that would look something like this as well, where we have the ID that changes, but that would be a PUT request. So this route structure is the typical structure of a simple CRUD application. For every different data type or resource we have, for example, blogs, users, books, authors, whatever the resource type might be, it might look quite similar to this kind of structure of URLs and types of requests. So in our application, we're not going to use the PUT request. We're not going to update blogs, but we are going to do the rest. Now, we've already handled these two at the top, /blogs, to get the index view with all of the blogs embedded in it. We've handled this request, /blogs/create, which gets us the web page with the web form on to add a new blog. So we need to do these three now. A post request to add new data, a GET request to get a single blog, and a delete request to delete a single blog. Let's look at the post request first of all. Alright then, so imagine you're a user on this website and you want to add a new blog. Then I'm guessing you would go to new blog, you'd add in a load of junk, and then you click on submit to add this new exciting blog to the website. Now at this point, we need to fire a post request to the server with all of this data included in the post request. Then on the server, we can handle that post request, we can take all of that data, create a new instance of a blog document using the blog model we created, add this data to that instance, and then save that document to the database. So that's the sequence of events that needs to occur. So the first thing we need to do is send a post request from this web form when we click on submit. Now there's a couple of ways we can do that. We can do that using the Fetch API or some other asynchronous library from JavaScript, or we can do it directly from the web form itself. So we're going to do it from the web form itself. And to do that, we need to open up our create view. And all we need to do is add a couple of things right here. So inside the form tag, we need, first of all, an action attribute. And that is basically going to be a value to where we want to send this request to. Well, the URL for this post request is going to be to /blogs, right? We saw that in the different request URL chart we saw before. So we also need another attribute, and that is going to be method, and that is the request method. So this is going to be a post request. Now, when we click on submit, this is going to send a post request to this URL right here. Now, we also want it to send all of this data and attach it to the body of the post request so we can access that on the server. And to do that, we need to add name attributes to these input fields. So the name of this one is just going to be the same as the ID, probably, the title. The name of this one is going to be the snippet. And the name of this one at the bottom is going to be body. Okay? So then, when we access the form data on the server, we'll use these properties to access that form data. All right then, so that's all we need to do. So when we click on this button now, it's going to send this post request. Now we need to handle that on the server. So what we need to do is, first of all, come down to blog routes over here, and I'm going to create a post handler. So to do that, we say app.post. So before we handled get requests, now we're handling a post request. So app.post, and we want to scope this to /blogs. That's where we're sending the request to right here. And then we want to fire back a callback function. So let's say request and response. And inside, we want to save a new blog document to the database, but we need access to all that data that comes along for the ride in this post request when we click on submit. This data, and this data. So how do we get that? Well, first of all, we need to use a bit of middleware, which is going to pass the data that we send into a workable format that we can use, and it's going to attach it to this request object. So I'm going to come up to where we use some middleware, and below the static middleware right here, I'm going to paste this in. So it's middleware that comes along with Express. So we say app.use express.url encoded, and then we say extended is true inside. We don't need to do this. This is just an option that you can add in. So this basically takes all the URL encoded data that comes along for the ride, and it passes that into an object that we can use on the request object. So down here, inside this post request handler, we can now access request.body, and that contains all the information we need from the web form. Let me just log this to the console so I can show you. Request.body, like so. And we're going to open up the console down here. Okay, let's send a request now. So if I go over here and just click on submit, then it's going to reload the page. That's the default action of a form. When we click on submit, we'll sort that later. But if we go over here, we don't see anything logged to the console. And that's because we actually need to refresh this page to catch the front end changes we made over here. So schoolboy error, let's refresh the page and let's add in a load of stuff again. Submit. And now, if we go back over here, we can see this object right here. We have the title, the snippet, and the body. So all of that now is attached to request.body, and that's because we used this thing right here, okay? If we didn't use this right here, let me comment that out, and let me come over here again. If we try to submit this again, let me refresh. Over here, continue. Let me just go back. In fact, this will be quicker. Okay, if we try to do this again, add in a load more data, submit, then come down here, it's undefined. So we can only do this stuff where we get the request.body if we use this middleware right here, okay? And that's for accepting form data. So let me save that now. And now down here, what do we want to do with this data? Well, really, we just want to save it to the database. But first of all, we need to create a new instance of a blog. So let's do that. Let's say const blog is equal to new blog. And we pass in an object with the different properties, remember. But that object looks very much like this object right here. So all I need to do really is just say, okay, well, request.body. Then we're passing that object in, which is this thing right here. So we're creating a new blog with a title, snippet, and body. And that's all we need to do. So now we have that, we can say blog.save to save this to the database. It's asynchronous, returns a promise. So we tack on .then and fire a callback function when this has done. So we can take the result here just in case we use it in the future. But at this point, what do we want to do? After a user has clicked on this button right here, yeah, and it submits that to the server, we save that to the database. What do we want to do then? What do we want the user to see? Well, I'd like to redirect them back to the home page so they can see that new blog right here on the list. So all we need to do is say response.redirect, and we're going to redirect to /blogs, which is where all the blogs are listed. So we also can attach the catch block right here, which catches any errors if there are any, and then we can log that to the console for now like that. Okay, so let's see if this works. I'm going to go to add a new blog. First, I need to stop that request. Go to add a new blog. The blog title is going to be like Yoshi's Party, and the blog snippet is come and have a good time. Wow, sounds amazing. Let's just put in a lot of rubbish here. Okay, so submit this. And now we get redirected to the homepage once this is done. And now we can see that new document right here. And if we go to the database and we refresh over here, we should see that new document here as well, which we do right here. Awesome. Okay then, so now we've handled these three routes right here. We still need to do these two right here. One for a get request to get a single blog, and one is a delete request to delete a single blog. Now to address those, we need to learn about this part of the route right here, and they are called route parameters.
Сколько стоит опыт? В 2008 году я впервые попал в Китай и начал возить товары, которые я покупал дешево и продавал.
Sure then, what are route parameters? Well, route parameters are the part of a route that are variable or could change. In this route, for example, this part in green, the ID would be variable and it could change dependent on the blog that we want to get. So for example, we could go to /blogs/12345, and this right here would be the route parameter, or /50, and this would be the route parameter. It could even be /hello, it doesn't have to be a number, we're not setting up rules. We're saying here that this part of the route is changeable, it's like a variable that a user types in, and we want to be able to extract this to see if it's an ID, and then we can query the database for the document with that ID and send it back to the user. So we need a way in Express to extract a route parameter from a URL so we can use it. Okay then, so there's a couple of things I want to do here with route parameters. The first thing I want to do is surround all of these with links so that they go to /blogs/ the ID of that particular blog. Now remember, each blog document has this ID, and when we use Mongoose, it converts this into a string for us. So this ID property at the top right here, we have access to inside our index view on each blog, because we go out, we get all of the blogs, and we're passing those into the index view, and we have that _ID property on each blog right here. So what I'm going to do is actually surround the H3 and the paragraph tag with an anchor tag. So let me do that first of all, and put the closing bracket at the end, so /A, okay, and let me just explain what this is doing. So we are now surrounding this with an anchor tag to /blogs/ and then we're outputting a dynamic variable which is on the blog, and that is the ID. So it's going to be /blogs/ whatever the ID is for that blog. I've also given this a class of single for CSS, and we'll do that later, but for now let's save this and go over to view this in a browser. I'm going to refresh. And now, if we click on one of these, for example, we go to /blogs and then / the ID of that blog. Now, it's going to change this ID dependent on what blog we click on, all right? So now we need to handle this request right here. It's a GET request to this URL, /blogs / the ID. So we need to now extract this route parameter from the URL in a request handler. So let's set that up. So over here, underneath the post request, we'll do this. So down here, I'm going to say app.get, and it's going to be for /blogs / and then to denote a route parameter, we use : and ID. If we just said, for example, ID, then it's going to look for /ID literally, not an actual ID. So there needs to be a colon in front of whatever you want to call the route parameter, all right? So then, now we have that, we need a callback function. We're taking the request and the response object, as always, and inside this function, I want to try and find a